I'm sure you've heard of the three-act structure. It's a model used in narrative fiction that divides a story into three parts, often called the setup, the confrontation, and the resolution. It is clear how, according to this structure, the story is told in one film. You just divide it into three acts. It is also clear how the trilogy works. The first film is the setup, the second is the confrontation, and the third is the resolution. But how is the story divided into acts if two films are allocated to tell it? Kill Bill, for example. Let's explore this in today's video essay. And before we start, make sure to subscribe to our channel and check out our other video essays. What unites Stanley Kubrick's The Shining and Ridley Scott's Blade Runner? Of course, their sequels, shot many years after the release of the original films, immediately come to mind. In 2017, Denis Villeneuve directed Blade Runner 2049, and in 2019, Mike Flanagan directed Dr. Sleep. However, none of these sequels were originally conceived by the filmmakers. Sir Ridley criticized the sequel to his classic movie, even though he himself was its executive producer. And Stephen King, the author of the book based on which the film was made, to put it mildly, didn't like how the great Kubrick treated his work. There were a lot of differences between the original source and its film adaptation, from the motives of the characters to the ending of the story. Therefore, in 2013, King released a sequel to his own, but not Kubrick's, version of The Shining, the rights to which, meanwhile, Warner Brothers acquired immediately after publication. As a result, Flanagan's Dr. Sleep is both an adaptation of the literary sequel to the book, which ended in one way, and a sequel to the film, which ended in another way. This case is really unique. However, from now on, Blade Runner and The Shining are movie dilogies, that is, stories told through two films, not one. It's not difficult to explain the appearance of these and other belated sequels, such as, for example, Tron Legacy, Dumb and Dumber, Independence Day, Resurgence. The reason is simple: money. But this was not always the case. For example, the very first ever sequel to a feature film was shot for a completely different purpose. We are talking about the 1916 film The Fall of a Nation by Thomas Dixon Jr., which became a continuation of the controversial David Griffith film The Birth of a Nation, which tells about the Klansmen saving the United States from the ignorance and savagery of its black population. Despite the fact that The Birth of a Nation was criticized and even banned in some places, this film became an enormous cinematic and box office success. It was wildly popular in the United States and even contributed to the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, which ceased to exist in 1870. The Birth of a Nation was based on the novels The Klansman and The Leopard Spots by Thomas Dixon Jr. The writer himself was called a professional racist, and as a Baptist minister, he actively opposed equal rights for black people, although he spoke out against slavery. Dixon was very popular in his years, but at the same time, it should be noted, he was a pretty mediocre writer. None of his books have stood the test of time, and it seems that Dixon soberly assessed his own talents that didn't prevent him from dreams of getting his controversial ideas out. He decided to take advantage of the popularity of The Birth of a Nation and made its sequel, The Fall of a Nation. However, while the original film represented some kind of interpretation by Dixon of the real historical context, The Fall of a Nation was more like the author's meditations. In his sequel, Dixon imagined that the United States was being attacked by the European Confederated Army, headed by Germany, and America was almost losing this war. Griffith, who personally earned $1 million on The Birth of a Nation, and that was an exorbitant amount of money at that time, refused to shoot the sequel, and Dixon himself sat in the director's chair. Later, he would say, the movie reached more than 30 million people and was, therefore, 30 times more effective than any book I might have written. Yes, the writer predicted the events of the Second World War in some ways, but as far as cinema is concerned, he miscalculated. The Fall of a Nation failed at the box office and is currently considered a lost film. Surprisingly, the story of the first feature-length sequel raises the problem of the expediency of making sequels as such. Yes, the sequels of Blade Runner and The Shining, which we talked about earlier, failed at the box office, but they were acclaimed both by critics and audiences. And even so, many sequels still seem unnecessary. That's because, in addition to the popularity of the original film, something else is needed that would contribute to the audience's interest: the open ending of the first film. In The Shining, Kubrick, who, it seems, wanted to make a film not about mysticism at all, leaves unanswered the question, what will eventually happen to little Danny, who went through a nightmare in the Overlook and obviously has superpowers? Stephen King made an attempt to answer this question in Dr. Sleep. And in Blade Runner, Ridley Scott deliberately made the viewer think whether Rick Deckard, the main character of this story, was a replicant or not. These potential discussions, caused by the ambiguity of the endings, become to some extent a factor in the popularity of the work. Thus, the sequel, by giving viewers a chance to find an answer to a question that has been tormenting them for years, provides itself with an audience in advance, and at the same time it is the occupation of a certain side to the dispute by the authors of the sequels. Whatever Scott says, Deckard is not a replicant. Villeneuve seems to assert in his film that on the one hand provokes part of the audience to not always reasonable criticism, but on the other hand prolongs the effect of discussing the story, thereby earning extra points. There are, of course, examples such as Tron Legacy, shot by Joseph Kosinski in 2010, 28 years after the premiere of the first film. Here, obviously, the bet of the producers who gave money for the sequel was placed on the undisclosed setting in the original film, due to the lack of technical capabilities suitable for solving such a difficult task, demonstrating the digital world in 1982. That is, the closed ending of Tron didn't allow the screenwriters to easily come up with a plot-based continuation of the story. But the potential of the world, invented by Steven Leisberger, helped the creators of the sequel, on the one hand, to come up with a new character and new adventures, but in a universe familiar to fans, and on the other hand, to continue and finally complete the path of the protagonist of the first film. By the way, here we can already move on to the discussion of how to technically write a good sequel to a film, the need for a continuation of which no one initially thought about. Yes, these are the DILOGIES, which we will discuss further. Let's call them non-obvious. After all, stories like Tarantino's Kill Bill are clear enough, because here we can turn to the so-called 5-act structure, described in the book Story by creative consultant Robert McKee. I talked about this in more detail in my video essay about The Godfather. The story of the main character of Kill Bill is created exactly according to this structure. In her case, the inciting incident is the resurrection, which changes her life for the better. Now, in order to restore the balance of life, she sets herself a goal: to take revenge on her killer Bill. This is her conscious desire. She overcomes one obstacle after another. They are embodied by O-Ren Ishii, Vernita Green, Bud, and Elle Driver. But somewhere along the way, she experiences a symbolic death. The role of this symbolic death is played by her burial alive at the beginning of the second film. But Beatrix ends up in the grave because of what happened in the first film. After killing Vernita, the character comes face to face with the daughter of her enemy and realizes that she has just committed the murder of a mother in front of her child. Beatrix was also about to have a child, for the love of whom she refused to keep killing. That's why Bill killed her. But taking the path of revenge, the character forgot about her desire. Now, having met Vernita's daughter, she remembered it and wondered, has revenge been driving me all this time? The symbolic death, experienced by the character in the middle of her story, is the death of the murderer inside her. From that moment on, she doesn't kill anyone anymore. As a result, Bud is killed by Ellie, but Beatrix leaves Ella alive. At the end of the film, the crisis that the character faces after learning that her daughter is alive is a choice between revenge and forgiveness. And following the principles of classical film dramaturgy, the character doesn't kill Bill, she forgives him, which allows her to restore the balance of life. The line of reasoning described above is very easy to lose because Kill Bill has a non-linear narrative. But knowing how the structure of the story works, it becomes almost impossible to get confused. Also pay attention to where Tarantino finishes the first part of his dilogy, at the moment of the symbolic death of the main character. That is, Kill Bill, Volume 1 is built not in accordance with the classical 5-act structure, but in accordance with only half of it. And at first glance, this is a mistake, since neither the viewer nor the character achieves catharsis at the end. But this is not quite true. It is in order for the audience to feel a sense of satisfaction from watching the first film that Tarantino uses a non-linear narrative, putting the scene of Vernita's death at the very beginning of the film and the duel with Oren at the end. As a result, purely on an emotional level, Kill Bill, Volume 1 works like an independent story, but on an intellectual level, it requires the viewer to watch the sequel. There are not many dilogies of this kind, but they still exist. Such dilogies include the recently released Nymphomaniac by Lars von Trier and It by Andres Muschietti. That is, these stories are immediately conceived as consisting of two parts, and in the first film, the journey of its main characters doesn't end, but only stops in the middle. More often, there are examples of dilogies in the sequels of which the character does not continue the story of the first film, at least directly, but rather embarks on a new journey. For example, the Raid Dilogy by Gareth Evans, or the Forrest Gump Dilogy by Winston Groom. Yes, you heard right. After the success of the film adaptation of his novel, directed by Robert Zemeckis, writer Winston Groom wrote a sequel to his book, Gump and Company, in which he described Forrest's new adventures. His character managed to cause the fall of the Berlin Wall, participate in Operation Desert Storm, and even take to the stage of the Kodak Cinema in Los Angeles, at the moment when Tom Hanks was awarded the Academy Award for Best Actor in Forrest Gump. Spielberg and Hanks even discussed the idea of a film adaptation of this literary sequel, but after the September 11th attacks, the filmmakers abandoned their plans. But in most cases, as can be seen from the recent sequel to Top Gun, a single story of a dilogy is told according to completely different principles. Dr. Sleep, Tron Legacy, Blade Runner 2049. In all these dilogies, the main character of the sequel is a new character. The main character of Blade Runner is Rick Deckard, and the main character of its sequel is Kay. The main character of Tron is Kevin Flynn, and the main character of its sequel is Sam, and so on. At the same time, the main character of the first film also appears in the sequel, as if continuing his line. But in this case, special attention should be paid to this. The ending of his journey, which he made in the first film, is always reset. Kevin returns to the system, but Rick still loses Rachel. Why is this happening? The answer is simple. Among other tasks, the sequel performs another one, the fan service. Filmmakers are simply obliged to bring fans back to the world of the first film, and it is not possible to do this solely by means of the setting, because the setting never works in isolation from the story. So the filmmakers have to repeat the plot devices familiar to viewers of the original film, but now they have to do it with a new character. And in this case, the story of the main character of the first film takes an antagonistic position in relation to the story of the main character of the sequel. Otherwise, the viewer will ask, why did I watch the same story a second time, only now with a new cast? So that this doesn't happen, the creators of the sequel say, not everything was in order with the controlling idea of the story that you know well. Perhaps there was an alternative to the journey taken by the character of the original film, and to check it out, you'll have to watch our sequel. That is, in each of the above examples, the protagonist of the sequel is always a new character. But at the same time, the character of the first film remains the main character of the whole dilogy. Perhaps The Shining dilogy has some differences from these examples. Here, the protagonist of the original film is Jack Torrance, played by Nicholson, and the main character of the sequel is his son Danny. But the main character of the whole dilogy is not Jack, but Danny. This is because Jack dies at the end of The Shining, which is impossible to give any doubt at the beginning of the sequel. And in this case, it is not Jack's line that is reset, but Danny's. How is this done? In the first film, Danny sees what a terrible man his father is. But at the beginning of the sequel, he appears almost an exact copy of him, an aggressive alcoholic who does not want to take responsibility for anyone but himself. Thus, we get the following scheme. In most of the DILOGIES, formed due to the fact that many years after the release of the original movie, its sequel was filmed, both the first part of the story and its sequel are independent works, created in accordance with the principles of classical film dramaturgy and having different protagonists. But at the same time, the storyline of one of the characters of the DILOGY is reset between two films and artificially stretched into two parts, becoming something like the core of the whole story. Well, that's it for today. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and watch our other video essays. Stay tuned. Bye.